Hey listeners, Britt Malazzo back with Bellefonte Area School District, bringing you the fourth installment of our podcast regarding the proposed elementary building project plan. Like the last couple, I'm here with members from Hunt who were hired to conduct the needs assessment. And again, this is really just to help put the district and the board in a better direction for approving a plan. Again, one has not been established yet, but there are several options that are being looked into, including renovating buildings, combining schools, and or a combination of both. So joining me again here today are Mike Jones, Darren Rathbun, Kate Doyle from Hunt, along with School Board President and Facilities Committee Chairman John Gazar, and of course a big welcome to Kate, who's with us for the first time. But in general, thank you guys again so much for virtually joining me here today.
Great, thanks for having us, Brett.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me here.
So yeah, I think I lost my feed there, so I will apologize in advance about that if you lose me for a second. But I am hopeful that someday we can actually meet for these podcasts in person. For now, this will have to do. But it has been a few weeks since we last met. I think we last talked about the phase of the needs assessment that looked at educational space needs. Since then, what has been done with your work?
So recently, we've pretty much completed the educational space planning, and we have been working on receiving additional community feedback, and we've been trying to really summarize that data into a packet of information that we shared at the Facilities Committee meeting. And we did get some feedback from that meeting that we did incorporate and update. So, we're looking to talk about that today, I guess, with some of your questions, go through that, and then also release that to the public for their review.
Sure, and during some of this too, you were able to meet with some of our building principals. What was some of the feedback back from then? I mean, I'm assuming because the buildings are all so different, there was a lot of different discussions that were had.
Yeah, we definitely did hear a lot of different things. Each building was different. Really, the goal of the space planning is to align the building, with the educational curriculum. So that was kind of step one, is just listening to where they may have issues or lack of space. We did hear specifically about, lack of special ed or support spaces. And then there's some existing areas that maybe don't function as well as they need them to, like the cafeterias and the gyms. A few of the libraries were outdated or don't have enough room. And we also talked about kind of a modern approach to the curriculum as we start to learn more about how STEM is fit into the curriculum. That really appeared to be a need for all 4 building principals to incorporate something on that end into the building.
Sure, Mike, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. If you can get closer to your mic and in
Sure.
Our next questions, try that.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, that sounds a little better. For our listeners too who are wondering, can you break down the phases of this needs assessment, starting from where you guys started and where you plan to end?
Yeah, so the phases were really, the first phase was the facilities walkthrough, where we did the condition assessment. And that really built a platform for what the buildings need to be updated in kind. And you'll see that in the packet. We've identified that as a kind of a phase one. Here's a cost and a view of upgrading all of your buildings as is. And then we started to build in this educational space planning, which would be the second phase of the assessment. So, and that's also in the packet, and you'll see how that's built. We do have floor plans in the space planning that show how that might look, a preliminary view of different spaces incorporated into the buildings. And, we're also trying to build equity throughout all 4 buildings. That was a common theme that we've heard through the community. And I don't want to leave out an important phase of it really throughout is the community feedback that we want to keep hearing throughout this whole process.
Right, and we'll get to that too. I know a similar study was done back at the end of 2016 into 2017. How does what you guys are doing compare to that study done a few years ago?
Well, that actually lines up good because the previous question we talked about the phase one, which that was really to upgrade the buildings as is. And that was really where the previous studies left off was, didn't really get into the equity piece or building spaces into the building that the building needs to match the curriculum. So I think our study does take into account, those space needs and equity in the buildings. And again, you can kind of get a look at that in the packet. We'll get into some charts that we can show you about really trying to align the square foot per student of each building. And we can compare existing to proposed, and there's some good information in the packet to look at.
Yeah, definitely, and we will look at that. We get a lot of comments from the public, and I think this might be a question geared for John, if you could answer it. Yeah, we get a lot of questions from the public or comments from the public asking, why the need for another building survey? The last one was done by a different company a few years ago. I know, John, you and I in the first podcast that we did, we talked a little bit about that. I'm hoping you can elaborate on that again, so our listeners, once they're listening to this, can have a better understanding.
Sure, Britt. Well, like Mike was explaining there, really the first study that we had done was looking only at a one-to-one. Let me rephrase that. So they were looking at building needs, but only in the sense of what was required from a safety standpoint to make sure there were no safety issues in the building. They were looking at what might be needed for protection of assets. In other words, do we need a new roof to make sure we don't lose the whole building from roof leaks? Any legal issues, ADA access. So they were really just looking at trying to somewhat modernize the buildings or at least bring them up to be within code as much as they could. And that's where that study stopped. That study did not take into consideration two key factors that are huge in this process. One being the educational space needs of the district and each building. And then one step further than that is to bring equity across the district, across the four buildings. I think anybody watching this would agree that for the longest time, everyone felt like Bellefonte Elementary had some serious equity issues when you compared it to, say, Marion Walker, that was recently had a lot of work done to it. So rather than look at just each individual building alone, we needed to look at the entire elementary education program more holistically and bring equity across the district to all students. So that's really, as Mike mentioned there, phase one. It was nice to see that there was alignment between the study that Hunt is now doing and the study that was done in the past as far as what it would take just to address some of those ADA and legal issues within the buildings. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So anyway, and those numbers matched up fairly well as far as the costs that we were given before from the previous firm to what Hunt had come up with in their review. Of course, the buildings are a little bit older, a little bit more aged, and the costs were a little bit higher because there were a few more items identified in that portion of the study. But again, and I'll turn it back over to you, Britt, is I can't stress enough where they left off in the previous study is what we really needed to have to make a responsible decision from the board's perspective. And that is, well, it's great to fix the buildings up, but if the buildings aren't working for the principals and for the students, then why put all that money into a building to still say, hey, these spaces don't match our educational space needs? Mm-hmm. So they really took a good look at that portion of the question of what really do we need for our program to more modernize it and come into alignment with today's standards, but then take a more holistic look, as I mentioned, and look across the district from building to building to bring equity district-wide.
Absolutely, and I'm glad that you clarified that again. Like I said, I know we talked about it before, but we can never talk about it too much, just to make sure that our community understands kind of where the district and where the board is at. So I do appreciate that. Now, I keep hearing the term equity come up quite a bit, especially when looking at all that among the buildings. Back to you guys at Hunt, I guess, can you specifically break down what you're seeing in terms of equity at each building? Again, we have those 4 buildings: Bellefonte, Benner, Marion Walker, and Pleasant Gap, and kind of how they all compare to each other.
Yeah, I think we can get into the packet on that, but just kind of an overview. Really, they don't compare as far as square foot per student, and special ed, or they're all different. Benner really had a lack of special ed space. They have just classrooms there, and they really don't even have a main office. That's another concern. So we're trying to take everything that they don't have and build it up, maybe where it's more equal to Marion Walker, that does have some of the things that the other buildings don't. A big thing for Bellefonte Elementary that you'll see is all of their existing classrooms are under the recommended square footage for modern educational space. They're all about 660 square feet, which is based on an old Pennsylvania School Act, and we recommend up towards 850 or 900 square feet. So you'll see a lot of that. Pleasant Gap too also had a lack of support space. I think they did have some undersized classrooms also that we're looking to address. So if you want, I think we can get into that packet and show you some of that information.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the perfect time to bring that up, as our viewers can see. If they are watching this, you can actually see we'll have some of those highlights. So I'll let you guys take it away and kind of talk about what you're featuring in this packet.
Okay. So yeah, it includes some community feedback. The first portion here is the assessment, which was kind of old news at this point. We reviewed this at the last facilities committee meeting, and we've been releasing this out to the public. We've had a couple podcasts about the actual conditions of the building. We did sit down and kind of break out our community comments that we've received. And this view here is kind of a summary of the community feedback that we've received so far. And also we look back at old records of previous studies, and you can see this bar chart really describes, we hear a lot about climate control and HVAC upgrades. There was a lot of talk about Bellefonte Elementary being upgraded. ADA and safety is important. And then the rest you can see there. You can read through, are all kind of equal. We heard about equity for all students, exterior, bigger library spaces. So a lot of the same stuff that we knew before, we heard again in this last round. So we just wanted to really highlight that in the packet. I think that's good.
Right, and for our listeners too, we will have that packet online in that elementary page where you can find that, and you can scroll for yourselves as well to check out all that information. Another quick question in terms of equity, can you further explain how that's being looked at? I know you said it's a kind of in a per student type thing, but can you elaborate on that and how you're looking at equity, since all the schools do have different student populations?
Yeah, you'll see that the square footage per student really is different. I mean, I guess I'd like to refer to the charts to really start to describe that. Do you want to continue to go down, Darren, and we'll try to get to the right spot?
Yep. Let me just jump right to it, I think. Is this the one you're referring to, Mike?
Yeah, so this is the cost that we were talking about. This would be good to hit because we kind of recapped some of our previous questions. This is the cost really for that phase 1 to upgrade the buildings as is. You can see that here broken down into cost per square foot and other ways. So that's some information to review there. And if you keep going, Darren. this is the second piece. There's highlights here for each building of what's included in the educational space plan. And then some of the charts here at the end really show what we need. Can you zoom in on that?
Yep. Yep. It's getting a little hard to hear you, Mike, but.
Okay.
You want the table or the graph?
I think the graphs are good, right? So, Kate, feel free to jump in on these. This is the
Right,
building use comparison.
Correct. We did look at the equity of the spaces on a per student scale. Specifically, we're looking at square footage per student. For instance, Marion Walker and Bellefonte have the highest student population, so the spaces overall will seem larger, but per student they're showing an increase or an equity between square foot of per student numbers. The charts that you're viewing right here are showing the percentage of square foot area per space. For instance, green is classrooms, the pink indicates support spaces or special ed spaces, the orange indicates special spaces like gyms, art rooms, libraries, etc. The inside circle of each graph indicates what is currently in the buildings, and the outside circle is how we've realigned or are proposing that the spaces are realigned so they are more aligned to each other.
Right, so I think the biggest takeaway from this sheet was that Bellefonte Elementary has the highest unusable space. You know, just given the age of the building, how it was constructed, there's a lot of space, you know, as far as just not used. There's larger walls that kind of make that gross area bigger than a normal building. So
Correct.
We thought that was a good chart to show how the makeup of Bellefonte.
Right. The other highlight here is Benner, that had only 3% support spaces throughout the building, and we've increased that to 6, which aligns better with the other 3 buildings.
Right. Yep. Good point.
Mm-hmm.
And is there anything
Okay.
else? Yeah, is there anything else too before we get into some other questions that you want to highlight in this packet before I interrupt you or anything? I would hate to do that.
Yeah. Let's just keep cruising through, Darren. I think there's another couple good charts here to look at quickly.
Okay, great. And then I appreciate this. I think this is going to be a real big help for our community too, as they kind of look through this with us. We have somebody describing exactly what that means. So thanks for doing that.
No problem.
Right. Yep. So this sheet shows the academic use, which existing you can see square foot per student for all the buildings on the third line down. You can see 99 for Bellefonte, 76 for Benner, 76 for Marion Walker, 95 for Pleasant Gap. So and then you can see proposed how we tried to improve that and make them align more. And you can see the 2 buildings, like Kate said, Bellefonte and Marion Walker, that have more students, do have a less square foot per student. And that's just due to the nature of the buildings right now. You know, Benner and Pleasant Gap are pretty small buildings, whereas if you add some academic space there, it'll make more square foot per student, really.
These circular charts speak back to that academic use versus non-academic use, and which really highlights how Bellefonte has almost 50% of their building is non-academic use, which includes your corridors, your stairways, things that the students are not using for class instruction. And unfortunately with Bellefonte, that's a little hard to adjust, seeing as it's a 3-story building, and that will always be a little bit higher on non-academic use. But what we tried to do with the remaining buildings is bring them closer so that the academic use is equal throughout.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's good there. Yeah, and this, if you want to zoom right in on the charts, Darren.
Yep.
This shows again existing on the inside ring proposed on the outside. And you can see this is really equity being built in, specifically Benner. If you look at support at 4.1 before, now we're trying to make sure they have enough support spaces just like the other building. And the outside is more in line with that. Was there anything else to really highlight here, Kate?
No, just that we're increasing some of these spaces so that they will have an adequate amount of space per student in each of the categories.
Just a quick comment there for me. For anybody watching and not understanding, well, why after the proposed modifications are we still not equal in classroom percentage for academic space? And as Mike had mentioned, a lot of that is a limitation of the existing building. We can't rework every single space to make every building, say, hit 50% exactly, because then you'd be reworking the whole building and adding costs that aren't necessary. So there will always be a little split, and that's just a function of the fact that you're in different buildings and you're trying to modify existing spaces rather than start from scratch. So just in case anybody was wondering that.
Yep. Good point.
All right,
Yeah,
thanks, John.
Great point.
Okay, yeah, this is good data too, if we can get a good look at it. So this is a breakdown of each grade level per building. It's listing the amount of students and the size of the classrooms that they have. So as you get down to first grade, you see those 660 square feet classrooms that are different at Bellefonte than the other three buildings. And as you scroll through this, we've highlighted, yep, this is existing configuration. And we've highlighted areas that are under a certain capacity calculation. So we're figuring 850 square foot space with 22 students in it. And we come up with, I believe it's around 38 square foot per student as a recommended. So we're noting that these grade levels in this building are under that recommendation.
Okay.
And then proposed, you can see, here is the proposed. You can see how we've adjusted those classrooms at Bellefonte and throughout the other buildings that were highlighted to really get rid of those spaces that were under the recommendation.
And again, like John pointed out, there are some limitations into what we can reposition and change. And we weren't changing the square footage of every classroom. So you can see that first grade, that still is at 38. But as grades change and grades get realigned, it's even throughout. And we brought up as much as we could.
Right. Yeah, a couple of those highlighted there are really more based on the enrollment. Like there's only 53 kids. So if you put that into 3 classrooms, it would be much lower. There'd be lower kids per class. So you bump it up and you do get a little bit of highlights there, but that's really not based on the space. That's based on the amount of kids. Okay, I think that's just a repeat of the last slide. And then the specials here, that would be a good thing to zoom in on because we did focus a lot on the art, music, library, gym, cafeteria, assembly, and the stage, which we're calling specials. So this is proposed and how we are trying to align these better, whereas trying to think like Benner before only had like a 800 square foot library. So we're incorporating that into the educational space plan, make sure they have a nice library like the rest of the buildings. That's just one example, but this would be a combination of looking at these comparisons and then looking back at the floor plans to see how we accomplished these spaces.
A good point to bring up here is that feedback we heard from the principals and the committee is that the gym spaces that are currently used, specifically at Benner and Pleasant Gap and even Marion Walker, that are a split use space are not functioning as efficiently as they could. We added, initially we added about 2,000 square feet to Benner and Pleasant Gap for a secondary gym space. But feedback from that was heard that it still was not sufficient enough to have for instance, a basketball game in that space. So we provided 2 full gyms then at Pleasant Gap specifically, and a larger at Benner to accommodate that bigger capacity and increase the space that they have throughout those activities.
And when you say feedback, was that feedback coming from the community, or was that feedback coming from our principals, for instance? Who was that feedback coming from?
That was the combination of the principals and then the committee that we have put together, which includes some community members.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and I would add that, excuse me, for as much as it's feasible at this point, given the environment that we're in, it's hopeful that the committee feedback is also inclusive of the community, because people know who's on the committee and they should be reaching out to each other. So the committee's acting sort of as a liaison between the community and the engineer.
Yeah.
Sure. And may I ask a question? I know we're going through this packet, but do you guys mind if I ask a question since we're kind of on the topic of some of this feedback?
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, just about, and just so our community knows, we do have a link out there where you can offer, feedback that you think is necessary, of course. The last I checked this weekend, there were about 30 responses to those. Can you talk a little bit about some of the comments that you guys have seen, among those 30 or so responses?
Yeah, I'm trying to do this a little bit from memory, but I do remember a lot still about the climate control being an issue. We heard a lot about that. There was a few in there about, that these buildings are the center of the community. We heard some specific comments towards Bellefonte Elementary that building is aged, and just people see the need that maybe is the biggest need in the district. But anything else you remember, Kate, that I missed?
And those comments are what is summarized on page 18 of this packet.
Right, those are included in this. Yeah.
So we kind of talked through some of that before, and it can be read in more detail there.
Right. And, I do hear every once in a while people saying in the community, well, I already gave feedback last year. Why do it again? Maybe, John, this is a good question for you to answer. What's your response for those people?
Well, I can say that the feedback that was given the last time has been fully incorporated into all the decisions up to this point. And there's new material. We need to keep the feedback and the lines of communication open. So I would strongly encourage anyone and everyone to be as involved as you can be. These are our schools, the community schools. The engineer that designs the final product, they might be here in name, but it's us, the community, and within the district that needs to be satisfied with our decision for, half a century potentially. So it's not, now hopefully in continuing the line of communication, we're also reviewing the additional materials that are out. I do think it's been said many, many times that any decision that comes out of this will be fully inclusive of upgrades to the climate control and HVAC. That's an automatic. So to continue with those kind of comments, it reinforces the need, but it doesn't bring new material from the community into the picture. We need just an honest look at the material that's being presented and be our eyes, be our check and balance to the system to make sure we're not missing anything additional.
Sure, absolutely. And I guess I'll just turn it back over to Hunt to take us through the rest of this packet.
Sure, yeah. I think we were right towards the end, and I think you did want to talk about some of the costs associated. So the last page, Darren really's got the cost of the full, educational space planning being included. You can see the cost there, and the cost per square foot charts, I think, are kind of tell a story in themselves. That you can see there that Pleasant Gap is one of, I think, is the highest cost per square foot. And then Benner and Bellefonte are shortly behind that, with Marion Walker being the last, just because it doesn't need as much existing upgrade to it, because it has been recently renovated. So I think that kind of summarizes where we were at with this packet. And if there's any other questions that, maybe the community has, or we're certainly willing to hear that feedback and jump on and maybe do another podcast to explain something if we need to. So,
yeah. Would it be worthwhile kind of going through the floor plans just a little bit, Mike, to show them or explain kind of the conceptual layouts for the spaces, the proposed spaces, that it's just based on square footages? It's not a final by any means. It's just basically trying to figure out volume and using that information so that we can make sure the equity across the board.
Why don't we look at
Yeah.
Benner as an example?
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, too, just to mention, as Darren pointed out, this is just a rough draft for generating volume and then associating a cost with that, because in the final design, another aspect that we'll be looking at obviously would be the flow of traffic. And one of the things that Hunt has tried to incorporate into this is a separation of, say, community-oriented spaces, so that we can maintain some security in the buildings as well.
yeah.
So this is an example of how the other floor plans are laid out. They're color-coded by any addition areas being in blue. And then any renovations, we have a heavy, medium, or light renovation area throughout the building. So for instance, with Benner, we saw a need for an increased library space. We would like to get rid of the temporary trailers that were installed initially, and there was additional need for classroom space throughout. So our addition includes the secondary gym space, which is a little bit smaller than a full basketball court, an art space, a library STEM maker space, and then some rearrangement of support spaces and the music classroom, so that the classrooms within the building are realigned and can work more efficiently. This also includes a new main office with secure vestibule, so that the office staff within the building can be all in one space and have the necessary area for them to function appropriately.
Yeah, so security was a big component of what we were looking at as well. I mean, the key is when you have visitors into the space, not allowing them to have access to the full building. So that's why you see here kind of the secured entrance vestibule.
Yeah, so it's not just limited to educational space. We really looked at the whole building, the faculty, the whole program of the building was really evaluated. And, this is focused on an improvement to Benner. For example, we presented this to the facilities committee, which included community members. We heard feedback about the gyms not being big enough. So we have updated this packet to include a larger gym, maybe to have some elementary type games in that space, a little bit bigger for community use. And then we actually did also add some more support room. You can see that on the right side, that little addition there, because when we looked at those charts at the facilities committee meeting, Benner was still much lower on the sports side. So this is kind of still evolving, but I think we've got it, up to date with the feedback we've heard so far.
Right.
And we're looking for more feedback on it.
Sure, absolutely.
And like was mentioned, it's only one solution to adding the spaces that are necessary. There are certainly more things that need to be incorporated when a final design is set out, but we at least can account for the area that's necessary to increase the square footage of the overall building.
And if I could jump in there too, I would say that this phase of the analysis really is looking at taking the community feedback of how important having the individual or the smaller communities is, this step of the process looks at maintaining each of those smaller communities. So as you see here, this is a new floor plan for Benner Elementary. Now, where the real challenge comes in is when those costs are built out and we look at the funds that we would have available versus the funds that it would take, then that might drive the exploration into it. Look at some other things of consolidation or maybe only a partial project, that sort of thing. So just to clarify that, this is trying to look at the community feedback, see how important some of those things were, and put on paper what it would take from a planning and financial aspect to make that happen, and then decide whether the district needs to do that or look at something different.
Sure. And John, let me chime in and ask, you know, I looked at some of these costs here. Those are some big numbers. Where does the district go from here in terms of what it's willing to spend? As a board and district, has anything been established yet? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, I wouldn't want to give hard and fast numbers. I can say that as a general rule, we've been looking at 30 million as the overall project cost that we're trying to stay at or below. And as you can see from some of these numbers, we're well above that. But I don't want to skew the decisions or skew the process any by saying that we're limited there. Like that's just a rough target that we were shooting for, because as a whole, the district might say, or the community might say, well, no, now that we see what we can have, maintain our small communities, maybe we want to do a referendum and allow for the additional monies needed. Maybe, especially in light of the current situation and times we're in, the community might say something totally different of, hey, you know, no tax increase due to these buildings, or cut the project back. We just don't know, but we have to do the process justice by going through each individual step.
Absolutely. I know that's kind of a tricky question to answer, so I appreciate elaborating on that a little bit and seeing kind of where we can go from here. So thanks, John, for that.
Sure.
Yeah. And again, I'll turn it back over to Hunt to continue with this.
I think we're all set with kind of the highlights of what's in these. You know, we've kind of laid it out here. Each building has its own floor plan with the same color codings and really the same process for all buildings. It incorporated 2 meetings with the principals, and then it incorporated comments from the latest facilities committee meeting.
Right. And if you can elaborate again, I think when I had asked this earlier in our conversation, what those conversations were like with the principals, I think it got cut off a little bit. Can you describe again what those discussions were like? I think, as I said before, each building has different population and different needs. So I think it would be interesting for our community to know what you heard in terms of feedback from the principals.
Yeah, I think one of the main things we heard about was a lack of special ed or support space. And we also heard about a lack of maybe pull-out or breakout spaces for STEM. I think that's a need going forward as maybe the district starts to plan on more STEM curriculum. Really, there's nowhere to pull out and work in small groups. So, you know, for instance, Marion Walker, when we did our facilities walkthrough, we noticed in the elementary wing, there's a table and chairs right in the hallway, you know, so they're pulling kids out there. So now we've added those small group rooms here into the library and kind of made the library a flexible STEM space. So we incorporated that STEM space into all 4 elementary buildings. So, you know, as that need for STEM curriculum grows, the buildings can be flexible to accommodate that.
Right. Thanks for answering that again.
Yep.
I know. Yep, and I know I seem to ask kind of the same questions at the end of each podcast, but I'm going to ask it again. Where do you go from here? What's that next step in the process?
So John did mention the word consolidation. You know, that's one thing to start looking at here as you see the overall costs. You know, this was the community feedback that we heard about upgrading the buildings where they are in the center of their communities. but now we need to really take a step back and look at all of the options. This is really where we enter a whole nother brainstorming phase of what are the options. And, we want to hear that from the community also. What do they think the options are? There's reconfiguration. We need to look at new building programs that maybe could be more efficient than the existing buildings. For example, we know right offhand that Bellefonte Elementary has a lot of gross unused area. So to us, that floor plan, that building is maybe not as efficient as building a brand new building for that many students. And also, once we get into a certain amount of students, we believe that there's some efficiency that can be built into a new building. For instance, your cafeterias and your kitchens, there's right around a 500, 600 student population in one building can really be efficient for a kitchen staff, for a cafeteria. You've got 3 periods of 200 students in each period. So there's certain things that we're going to look at there on the new program side. We're going to start looking at operational costs of the building and really evaluating the pros and cons of multiple options going forward. And we want to continue to promote the community feedback in every step.
And let me just add to that briefly by saying, and this is just food for thought for anyone watching, that the initial cost or cost difference between 2 options is not always the big picture. That's not really what we're shooting for. What we're really shooting for is to solve the equity issues within the district at the least life cycle cost possible. So, you put $15 million into Bellefonte Elementary, let's say, and do a bunch of renovations, but then find out that 10 or 15 years down the road, you have more major renovations to make. That's really not being good stewards of tax dollars. When you take into consideration the other items of utilities and all the other efficiencies that can be had from, let's say, a newer building or even a brand new construction, then what you're doing is really projecting the life cycle cost of that building over a number of years. And our goal is really to solve the issue for as many years as we can for the least amount of money. That's really what it comes down to.
Right.
Yeah.
And is there a deadline that you guys are looking to get to this point, or is there a timeline that you're trying to stay in between?
Well, pre-COVID, that was the end of March, but I think we're all understanding that's probably not very realistic at this point. So I can't speak for Hunt engineers, but all I can say is I appreciate their patience in sort of dragging out this project more than what was originally intended. And it sounds like you guys are in it for the completion, so I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've actually started into the next phase here, and I would hope that maybe within the next 2 weeks we'll have the next installment for the podcast.
Yes, absolutely. I always look forward to talking to you guys. Like I said before, I'm hoping to do it someday in person, but this will do. So yes, thank yous for joining me. Kate, thanks for being here. I'm glad to have a new face on. I think our viewers are really going to find this helpful as we continue to navigate this building project process. For our listeners too, I just want to give a reminder that you can find all this information on the Bellefonte Area School District website. That's www.basd.net. There is a link specifically there for this project that includes proposals, building study information, podcasts, community feedback links, and more. So please, please, please check that out. Additionally, you can come check us out online with just about everything else that we're doing in the school, and that too includes social media. Again, you don't need an account to see our content, so we'd love to have you join us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram to see our updates there. Guys, thank you so much. Appreciate the help as always.
Thank you, Brett. And
Thanks for having us on again.
And definitely, we welcome the community feedback. That's pretty key for us moving forward. Is seeing what the community thinks and trying to make all of their voices heard and get it incorporated into the documents here.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well, saying that this is not the preferred method. We had every intention for these types of meetings to be happening in person within the community to encourage more input. But again, the current environment has changed all that. So please do watch each podcast. And then I believe, Britt, correct me if I'm wrong, after each podcast, you have an area for feedback on that particular podcast. So please keep an eye on all this material. Give feedback on every single one if you can. It'd be greatly appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. That link is out there, and we'll continue to put that out to our community in every way possible. That obviously includes our website, social media, word of mouth. There's nothing that can't be done in terms of getting the word out to the best of our ability. So, yes, community members, you can find that in multiple places. Thanks again, guys.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
See you.
Yep, thanks, guys. So long.